And I've got the opportunity to introduce Jim. So Jim Graham, as I mentioned, is the author of Buried Truth, a poignant story of a man's search for his father, exposing powerful forces bent on hiding the truth. And the book was just published in August 2025, and I've had the opportunity to read it. Highly recommended. And with that, I will give you Jim.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you, Betsy, for having me. I have a very, first of all, I want to say I was not adopted, but I have several friends that were adopted. And when we talk about their experience and my experience, we have a lot of the same emotions and challenges. So I just want to be upfront that I'm not adopted. But I have a two-part story. It's a part that I'll explain at the beginning, where I was unaware of what would happen when at age 48, when I'd really find out um, the back end of the story. So in other words, I was clueless till I was 48 years of age as to my family situation, a family secret. And I'll start there. I'm originally from Buffalo, New York. Um, I lived in a small house on Errand Avenue with two sisters, one 2 years older and one 8 years older. And we were three generations of Grahams. My mother didn't live in the house. She was divorced from my father, John Graham. So in the house were the three of us, John Graham, his sister Kathryn, a spinster, and their parents, Stella and Otto. It was a 900 square foot house with a small room up in the attic, so it was very tight living conditions. In addition to that, we were raised Catholic, and it was a bit awkward going to church at St. Peter and Paul on Sunday when we'd file into the pew. John Graham wasn't religious, so he was off to his job at the Texaco station downtown Buffalo. So I would go to church with my two sisters, my Aunt Catherine, and my grandfather had passed away, so it was just Stella, my grandmother. And we'd follow into the pew, and I'd see all my classmates there with their fathers and their mothers and their siblings. And it just always felt like we were being stared at because we were the only family that I knew of in the parish, a growing parish that we had a divorce situation. I always considered our family a fractured family because the principals in the house, Catherine, the Spencer aunt, and my father, John Graham, were not affable. It was a house without laughter. It was a house without mentoring. It was a house without saying I love you. It was a house where there were no hugs. It was a very cold, strange house. And at one point, and my mother, was divorced from John Graham. She lived in Far Rockaway, Bureau of Queens, in Queens, a Bureau of Queens, and 400 miles away. And she would see us two times out of the year. She lived 400 miles away. We'd see her four consecutive days at Easter vacation. The hours were from 10 in the morning to 7 o'clock at night, very well controlled. And during August, we'd see her in four consecutive days. Again, the hours were 10 in the morning to 7 o'clock, no overnights. So it was a very strange, restrictive childhood that I had. And John Graham was short, physique, powerful build, gruff, quick-tempered, and again, not very friendly, especially to me. As far as my sisters were concerned, I'd say they might call him an unfatherly father, but I would call him somebody that had disdain for me. There was just like for some reason he didn't like me, and I actually feared him because of his physique and his short temper, and so I did everything I could to stay out of his way so that I wouldn't be there wouldn't be a physical altercation. Um, at one point, I got brave when I was about 7 years old, and I had been asked by the neighborhood kids, where is your mother, Jim? We never see your mother. So I went to Stella, my grandmother, and asked her what I should say to them. And she said, she looked up at the air and she was thinking, well, don't ask me, ask your father. So again, John Graham was pretty intimidating, and he would work long hours at the gas station, leave early in the morning before we got up, and come back after we've had supper. So his mother, Stella, would make a meal for him, normally a steak and mashed potatoes. Later on, just for him. So one morning, well, excuse me, one evening, I went into that room cautiously, and I looked around the corner in the nook in the kitchen. I said, "I'd like to ask you a question." He says, "What is it?" And I said, "What should I tell my friends in the neighborhood when they ask about my mother?" And she said, "Tell them she's dead. Tell them she's dead." So that was the kind of situation I was living through. And of course, I didn't, tell them she's dead, because we would get Christmas cards from her. We'd get Christmas presents. We'd get birthday cards. I would see her, at least 8 times out of the year. But it was a very, very strange upbringing. And there were just many mysteries that I just didn't understand. And there's nothing I could do to control them. When I would see my mother on the visitations, at one point I asked her, "How did John Graham, how did my father get custody of us?" And she said, "We had a very powerful attorney, and I didn't have the funds. So in court, he won the case. And that's why you and Connie and Joan are in his custody." And so later on, I asked her, "Why did you name me James? Because everybody in the family is Otto or John. Those are all the names." And she said, "Well, I just like the name James." So as time went on, as I was getting older, getting ready to go to high school, I asked John Graham if I could go to the better high schools downtown in Buffalo, either Canisius or St. Joe's, because 90% of the kids that went there went on to college, because they were, good schools, and they're grooming children to be good leaders in college. And John Graham said, "No way, you're going." And then, as it was time to go to college, and I had worked in high school, I'm a talented artist, and was at a Catholic school where they didn't have art classes. So my last year of high school, I went to Williamsville High School, where I could take classes. Plus, I took summer classes in art, and I wanted to go to Pratt Institute in New York. And I was groomed that way. The guidance counselor said, you got great marks. You'll do very well at Pratt." So I asked John Graham just before I was about to go to college if he would sign a student loan. He said, "No way, I'm not going to sign a student loan for you. If you drop out, I'm stuck with the bill. Get a job or go to Buffalo State where your sisters went." So it was, the typical answer from the man of the house. So I bided my time. I went to Buffalo State, took art education, didn't want to be a teacher, but I was there about a month and a half. And I came home from school, and I walked in the house, and I was met by Aunt Catherine and my grandmother, Stella, and they had an envelope in their hand, and they're waving it. And they said, "We got a letter here from Ruth, your girlfriend." And they never had met Ruth, because I'd never bring anybody to our home. It would be embarrassing. It would be awkward to bring them in there. When I was a 7-year-old, my older sister Joan had a birthday party for me, and there were about 8 or 7 children, 7-year-olds in the backyard, and one of them made a mistake in the bathroom and got plugged up when he was there, and Aunt Catherine went after him, just reamed him out. So after that incident, I never brought anybody to our house. I didn't want them to experience that. So there they are, waving this letter from my girlfriend Ruth, who's going to Casanova College in Syracuse. And they said, "You shouldn't be doing it at this age. You're gonna get, you can't get married at this age. You better get on with your life and leave her. Just drop that." So I just couldn't believe that they opened my mail. It was like the last straw. So I walked out the door, slammed the door, hopped in my 53 Ford that I paid $80 for, and started driving, just driving fast. And I wasn't really sure where I was going, but I knew I was never going to go back to that house. Luckily, I had enough gas to get to Syracuse, to Casanova College, where my girlfriend was going to school, and I borrowed $30 from her, which filled up the gas tank and gave me money for tolls. And the rest of the way, I went down to New York, where my mother lived. And she was surprised to hear from me. I was at Idlewild Airport before they called it Kennedy, and I called her and I said, "I'm looking for your home in Far Rockaway." And she said, "Well, just stay there and we'll come and pick you up." So when she had come up on the visitations during the summer, she came with her second husband, John Wolfe, who was a New York City cop. And actually, I really enjoyed those visitations, because at least for 4 days out of the year, I had a fatherly figure with me, but only from 10 in the morning to 7 o'clock at night. Anyway, they took me back to their home, and that's the first time I've ever slept in my mother's house since I was a toddler. So it was kind of a really unhappening, it was a strange reaction, relationship, and it's just one of those nights where you'll never forget it, because I'm actually in her home. I stayed there for about 4 months. I immediately got a job with American Airlines in the mailroom and commuted back and forth from Far Rockaway to the North Shore of Long Island to LaGuardia. But after a while, Johnny Wolf, who was, fatherly to me on those summer days in August, was kind of getting tired of having a teenager around. And I can see their point. They didn't have any children, and I was like a third wheel. So I found an apartment across from LaGuardia Airport with three other airline people, and that's where I went for the next couple of years until I got a draft notice from the U.S. Army. And not being married and not going to college, I was fair bait. So I was picked up in the May 1966 draft, the largest one of the war, and I spent 2 years in the service, 1 year in Vietnam in the Mekong Delta, captaining a mike boat. While I was in Vietnam, I wasn't getting letters from Ruth anymore because when I was in basic training, she sent me a Dear John letter, and so I didn't have a pen pal like the other guys until my mother started writing me every week. And she did. She was very faithful, and she would keep me abreast of what's going on in the United States, and I would look forward to those letters. And when she passed away, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, those letters that I sent her, she kept. And after she passed away, I found them in her personal effects. And those letters have some information in there that would solve some of the mysteries that I had in my childhood. But it wasn't until 35 years later that I actually read those letters, after she died in 1993. Um, at the airlines, I was fortunate enough to, I came back from Vietnam in good shape. I was fortunate enough to go back to my job at American. And one late afternoon, when I was at a gate, boarding a gate of passengers, a young lady came up to the gate and she said, "I'm off to San Francisco. I didn't have time to call my boyfriend. Would you do me a favor and give him a call and tell him I'm going to be on flight 21?" And I said, sure, I'd be happy to do that. And she was American Airlines stewardess in plain clothes, out of uniform because she's flying down from Toronto after doing some promotional work in Toronto. But I said to the agent next to me, he said, "I'm going to see her again." And at that time, I wasn't dating stewardesses. They had irregular hours. They worked weekends. They had 6 o'clock sign-offs. I was dating mostly ground girls. But I did see her again the next day, and we went up for a Coke and a coffee in the coffee shop. And after that, we started to date on a regular basis. So I married Melody Maynard about a year and a half later. And at that point, we progressed both with the airlines and eventually went on and we started our own business and successfully enjoyed working together and not being employed, being self-employed, where you had more options and more freedom. So this is 1993. Excuse me for a minute. Melody and I were out in San Francisco. I was there on business. I was doing some financial work for some small public companies. And the night before my uh, 2 days for the financial conference, we went to a nice restaurant in San Francisco. And I had a vodka on the rocks, and Melody normally drinks wine, but she said, "I'll have one too." So I knew something was up. So while we were sitting there waiting for my next one, she said, "Do you ever have any ill feelings about your sister? I know you had issues with her, my older sister Joan." And I said, "No, no, not really. Joan knows, just because we're relatives, we're not always going to be best friends. But I do have an issue with my Uncle Otto. I just don't understand it. He just isn't treating me like he did when I was 6 or 7. It's very, very difficult to understand why he would do that." And she said, "Well, I'll tell you." And she said, "John Graham, his brother, who had died in 1979, is not your father. Your father was a priest, Father Thomas Sullivan." So there we are in San Francisco, 3,000 miles from home, and I've got to go to 9 o'clock and stand in front of a booth and do some presentations. And all of a sudden, I realized that I'm not who I thought I was. It was just like looking at a kaleidoscope of all the issues I had as a child, and all of a sudden it's coming to light why that impacted me the way it did, why John Graham treated me the way he did, because John Graham and his family were coerced to have me look like I was their son, but I wasn't even related to them. John Graham was married to my mother, yes, but I have no blood relationship to John Graham or Aunt Catherine or Stella or Otto, the grandfather. So I couldn't sleep all night just thinking about all the issues I had as a child, and this is why it all happened. So I knew as soon as I get back to New York, I would call Kathryn and Otto and sit down with them because John Graham was deceased. He died in 1979. And I would speak to them. And I just, wasn't sure how I'd approach it, but I had to have a sit down with them. So when I got back, I called Kathryn and she said, I'll see if Otto will do it, but I don't know. And anyway, he agreed to do it. So we met a couple of days later at his home in Buffalo. And I'd like to read for you something from my book. It's an excerpt. It's in chapter 9, and it's called Hell's Kitchen for two reasons. Because I'm in their kitchen doing my investigation of them, and also my real father, Father Thomas Sullivan, I found out later lived in Hell's Kitchen on the west side of Manhattan. So here we go. Following Melly's revelation, I experienced several sleepless nights. I struggled to come to grips with the fact that I had been duped, not only by my family, but by my church, which is supposed to stand for mercy, compassion, and righteousness. Church and family had teamed up to draw a veil of secrecy and deceit over my life. I was convinced that the man I had always thought as of my uncle, John's brother, Otto, had shared the truth with his son, Johnny, who leaked the information to Melody, knowing it would somehow get back to me. The previous winter, in a conversation with Johnny at his home in Fort Myers, Florida, I spilled some of the confusion and the anger I had felt whenever I tried to make sense of my growing up in a strange, emotionally crippled household on Aaron Avenue. I believe that Otto's intention was not to reveal the truth that he had helped conceal for so long. He just wanted to pay me back for daring to criticize his brother. Otto had done me a favor. Now that I knew something about the truth, I was determined to learn as much as I could about my mother, my real father, and me. The starting point was obvious: Otto himself and his sister Kathryn. As I phoned Kathryn as soon as I got back to Long Island, Kathryn was wary. She said, I'll have to see if Otto will agree. She said, given my conviction that Otto had intentionally floated the story in my direction, I figured he would jump on the chance to rub some salt into my fresh wound. Sure enough, at Christmas Day telephone conversation, Kathryn told me that Otto had agreed to meet. 3 days later, I met with Kathryn and Otto at his home in Kenmore, a neighborhood in the northern part of Buffalo. While I was growing up, we had often celebrated Christmas and family gatherings there. There were some good memories from those holidays with a household of people. Otto played the role of a jolly, welcoming uncle. Now it was just the three of us sitting around an oak table, two dour 80-year-olds and me, the object of their disaffection. Otto was a lifelong smoker and suffered from emphysema. His oxygen bottle was on the floor behind the chair. Otherwise, it was an ordinary mid-century American kitchen. There were formica tops, maple cabinets. Everything was tidy and clean and somewhat dated. Ever since San Francisco, the truth, which was difficult for me to grasp at first, had been slowly sinking in. I was not a Graham. I was not related to either of these people, and they had participated in a decades-long conspiracy to deny me the truths of my own life. At the same time, they had never been able to let go of resenting me for being who I was. As his brother's funeral, Otto said to me, I don't know whether to love you or hate you. As a child, I'd always sensed the resentment, and I could feel it in that kitchen. Kathryn pulled out a Catholic newsletter from her purse, unfolded it on the table, and pointed to the obituary of an elderly priest. I could sense, I could see in my own face, and I could see my own face in that photo, my mouth and chin, my eyes and brows. There was no question in my mind that this man, this priest, Father Thomas Sullivan, was my biological father. Beyond physical resemblance, the face in the photograph suggested a sad, deep sadness, as though he had regretted the role he played or didn't play in my life. The choices he made had destroyed any possibility of a happy family life for himself, my mother, and me. He turned his back on human love and family and surrendered to a powerful institution. As I studied the priest's face, I read something more. There was a weary, beseeching look, as if he had known the moment would arrive and that his son would one day be faced with the fact that his entire life had been based on a painful lie. It was a look of remorse transmitted across the years to the son he had given up. It would embolden me to seek the truth and strengthen me to endure the years of frustration as I pounded on the doors of the Roman Catholic Church, trying to induce this institution to confess the story of my father's life and my own. I looked up at Kathryn and Otto. Did your brother always know that I was not his son? Otto shook his head. We aren't going there. We are not going to relive the past. This is of no interest. What is done is done. So all you're offering me is the obituary of a man who may be my father. So from there, I had to decide, how am I going to prove that Thomas Sullivan is my father? The Grahams leaked the situation, and the Catholic Church got on him right away and said, "You got to put the genie back in the bottle. You can't tell him anything more." And I knew going to the Catholic Church wasn't going to be easy. These are men I respected. We learned to respect them when we were, kids in school, going to Catholic schools that, they were put them on a pedestal because they're the representative of Jesus Christ right here on earth. So I knew it was going to be difficult to get them to, say that they were guilty of hiding the fact that my father was a priest. So I started out and I went with Melody actually on my first trip, and it was an appointment I made up in Tewksbury, Massachusetts, which is the home of the Oblate Order for the Northeast of the U.S. And I used a kind of a way to get in there without saying I'm Father Sullivan's son. I didn't want to abruptly do that because I figured they'd shut me down immediately. So I just suggested I'd like to go up to and meet with you because I understand my family in Buffalo was very friendly with the Father Sullivan, and he was a great guy, and I'd just like to know more about him. So anyway, Melody and I went to the appointment, and we went to see Father Reddy, who was writing the newsletter for the Oblates. And my father, when he was a priest, he didn't run a parish. He was the academic of the order. He had a degree in doctor's degree in theology, and he started the newsletter, worldwide newsletter, and he was the editor for 35 years. So I figured this is a good place to start. This is his replacement. So I went in there, didn't say that I'm Tom Sullivan's son. I just said I'd like to learn a little more about him. And he had a great review from Tom Sullivan. None of these priests ever said your father. They'd always refer to him as Tom Sullivan in my company. But he was a great orator. He could debate anybody in theology. He was a bright guy. He could really give a great sermon, so on and so forth. And I knew that he knew that I knew that that I knew that he knew that I was Tom Sullivan's son. But I just felt, he was standoffish in a way. He said, by the way, Tom Sullivan has some people here at the retirement home, and they're classmates of his, but don't bother calling on them because they don't have any more information than I just gave you. I'll let you know down the road. I called on all of them, but for that moment, I just pretended like. I'm moving on. He's not going to recognize me as Thomas Sullivan's son, even though he knows it. And so we walked out, and Melody said, "How come you didn't tell him?" And I said, "I just felt he was the wrong person to tell." But he did mention at that meeting that the Sullivan family lived in Lowell, and when Melody and I hopped in the car and went down the freeway, the next exit was Lowell. So we got off in Lowell, and I went to the first Catholic church I could find. I found out later there's 14 Catholic churches in Lowell. It's a small town, but it's a very Catholic town. And I asked the pastor if he knew about the Immaculate Conception, where my father had been a priest and was raised. And he said, "Yeah, gave me the directions." And he said, "Actually, there's a elderly priest there that was a good friend of Father Sullivan's, and he may be there. You might find him there." So anyway, we go to the rectory, and where the secretary is looking all over for him. And what do you know? The door walks in, opens behind us, and there's an older priest, and it was Father Savage, a close friend of my father's. So we mentioned we'd like to learn a little bit more about him. So he said, "Follow me down the hallway." So we went to this big office, very ornate desk. Melody sat on one side, I sat on the other. He looked at us and he said to Melody, "Are you an attorney?" And she said, "No." He looked at me, "Are you an attorney?" I said, "No." He said, "Whatever we say in this today is going to stay in this office. It's not going to go beyond these walls." So I said, He said, "Yeah, I know." I said, "How do you know?" "You look just like him." So we're lucky we caught a priest off guard who hadn't heard that I was out there knocking on doors. This was the only second attempt, I had. So Father Savage gave me some good information that he recanted later when I went there a second time. But the first thing he said, He said, "Did you get your money for your education?" I said, "What money?" My story here, John Graham, didn't give me the chance to go to, the better schools in high school or go to Pratt Institute. So when he looked at me and I said, "What money?" His face was distorted. He said, "We wanted to do the right thing, and money was put aside for education." I said, "Father, I never received it. I have no idea where it is." And then he went on and said, I said, where was my father when he was with my mother? Because I know that they left Buffalo with me when I was an infant. Where did they go and what was he doing? Well, he said that private detectives were hired and they found him, found the three of you in New York City. And we heard, he said, it's just hearsay. And I'm sure he knew real exactly what was going on. But he was just like an short order cook, a bartender. That's what he was doing to get along. And he tried to end the conversation very quickly. And he said, you've got good genes, you're relatively young. Forget the injustices of the past and get on with your life. So that's how he left us. But I was delighted because there I had recognition that I am his son from somebody that knew him well. After that, it was much tougher because Father Sullivan called up the superior of his order and told him that I had stopped in. So from that day on, no priest was giving me the information like Father Savage gave us. It was very, very difficult. Um, so what I did is I hired some private investigators, just like the church had hired when they were looking for me and my mother and Father Sullivan in New York City, and looked for documents. And I did my own document chase, looking, following the money trail, following the family money trail. And while I was doing that, I got a document from the investigators, and they said that they went to Buffalo and they went to the family court, and they found the transcript of the um, divorce between John Graham and my mother, Helen Graham. And in there, it's very descriptive about the money that evidently had to be paid by the powers that be. I always use that because I don't have receipts of the Catholic Church paying for these operations where you're hiring private detectives to follow three people, to find them in the first place, and then follow them and know what their habits will be, which they did. On July 29th, 1947, my second birthday, the detectives told John Graham, his brother Otto, and they invited a friend to go with them to drive down to New York City, stay at the Governor's Hotel, and they would call him during the evening, middle of the night. So they checked in the hotel at 2 o'clock in the morning. They got a call from one of the operatives, and he said, meet us at this address on the west side in Hell's Kitchen. And it was a flat where my father had been living. My mother wasn't with him. She was a nurse and she was staying in the nurse's quarters at the hospital that she worked at. And I was in the Foundling Hospital, an orphanage, and they were paying my fare $2 a day to care for me because, they're trying to scrape out a living and they didn't have a way to have home care for me. So the Sisters of Charity took care of me for 13 months. So anyways, I have the document of the divorce trial. And in it, my mother didn't attend to the trial. She had her own divorce taken care of in Reno, Nevada. So she didn't go to the trial. But in the trial, the bottom line was there was the last thing in there. It said if she was going to remarry, she could only remarry John Graham, and if she wanted, she'd have to get permission to marry somebody else. But this is something very illegal. But this is the kind of stuff they were doing in those days. And because I've taken that document to attorneys, and they said this is, it's against the Constitution. They can't tell you who you're going to marry or in what state. Um, so any event, I also tried to get some help from the media since I was having a hard time with the oblates. They just weren't caving. So a friend of mine told me to go see the movie Spotlight. I don't know if any of you have seen it, but it got the Academy Award in 2016 for Best Movie. He didn't tell me why to see it, but then I saw it and I knew why he told me to see it because the Boston Globe did a very good job investigating the clergy abuse cases up in Boston. So I went home to my computer and drilled down, and I found the term spotlight within the Boston Globe um, directory, and it's for big projects, really big ones like the clergy sexual abuse case was. So anyway, I sent an email to Mike Resendez, who was portrayed in the movie, just a page and a half, an overview of my story. And I figured I'm never going to get a response from him, but at least I'll take a shot. I'm trying everything else. So 2 hours later, after sending the email, I get a response from him, and he said, "We're interested." So if Julius is there and he could play this short video, we'll pop it in and bring you up to date with how Mike Resendez got on my story.
And BostonGlobe.com investigates the children of Catholic priests. The paper reports there are thousands of people who have strong evidence they are sons or daughters of clergy members. They say they're often neglected or shamed into silence. In an interview you'll see only on CBS This Morning, Boston Globe Spotlight team reporter Michael Resendez is here. But first, we have a look at Spotlight's legacy of groundbreaking reporting.
Mr. Gagan, what do you say to your alleged victims?
Gagan is accused of molesting dozens of children from the 1960s until his retirement in 1993.
In 2002, the Boston Globe Spotlight team ran more than 600 reports revealing a scandal within the Catholic Church. Hundreds of priests had sexually abused thousands of children over decades, and church leaders covered it up.
Unprecedented calls for the resignation of the most powerful man in the American Catholic Church, Cardinal Bernard Law.
The paper won a Pulitzer Prize for the coverage.
They knew, and they let it happen. 2 kids. Okay?
The reporters became the story in the 2015 movie Spotlight.
And the Oscar goes to...
It won 2 Oscars, including Best Picture.
Spotlight.
This morning, the Spotlight team unveils a new report on what it calls a worldwide and systemic problem within the Catholic Church: priests fathering illegitimate children.
I was blaming myself, like I was his mistake. By him having a child, I was his mistake.
Well, we reached out to Vatican officials for a statement regarding this new reporting from the BostonGlobe.com, but they declined to comment. The Boston Globe's Michael Resendez joins us now. Good morning.
Good morning.
First, this is incredible reporting. I know you spent so much time on it. First, how many children of priests might there be?
Well, we know there are many more than people assume, probably in the thousands. Just recently, about 2 years ago, a son of a priest in Ireland set up a website called Coping International, and he's heard from scores of people from all over the world who are the sons and daughters of Catholic priests.
What prompted you to start this investigation?
I first heard from a fellow named Jim Graham, who's in the story today on Globe.com. And Jim spent many years tracking down evidence that a priest was his father. I was impressed with what he suffered, the pain he endured, and I was impressed with his detective work. But still, it was just one person. And it wasn't until Vincent Doyle called me and gave me the information he'd collected through his website that I realized this was a systemic situation and deserved my full attention.
Thank you, Julius. 3 times Mike put my story on the front page of the Boston Globe, and the publicity really helped because I got the attention indirectly of Cardinal Sean O'Malley in Boston. And I was supposed to meet with the Cardinal, but at the last second, they said no, because he didn't want to own my story. But someone else represented it, a very good speaker, someone who was actually sexually abused by priests, who saw my story in the Boston Globe, and he said, Jim, I think I can get you in to see Cardinal O'Malley, because he's an advocate for people that were sexually abused, and he's got some help through the Cardinal. But so he presented my story while I sat in the chapel downstairs at Brain Street in the Cardinal's office. And that conversation moved the Cardinal to call the head of the order, the Oblate Order that my father belonged to, who is based in Washington, D.C., Father Studer. So Father Studer called me. He said, Cardinal O'Malley suggested I give you a call. And I heard, and he said, when I was officiated, when I was got the job of being the provincial, they warned me that you were lingering out there. So actually, I wore that as a badge of honor that, I didn't give up. But in any event, Father Studer was not pastoral at all. He was ranting and raving. You can't prove Tom Sullivan's your father. You just can't prove it. I mean, you literally, my wife was in the other room. She could hear his voice through the cell phone, ranting and raving. And actually, he hung up on me about 40 minutes through the conversation. Then he called me back and he apologized. And he said, I called Father O'Donnell, who you suggested I call to, because you believe he knows that you're the son of Father Sullivan, but he can't prove it either. So that was kind of the end of the conversation. In the past, I always thought I could prove my father was Tom Sullivan if I exhumed his body, but I never wanted to do that because they would think it's just grandstanding and they're never going to take it seriously. But since they said you can't prove it, I said, well, I can't prove it. So I sent them a letter and I said I can prove it if I can have access to his remains, because I'm sure the DNA will tell everything that everybody knows, but they're just not admitting. So I never expected to hear back from them. And I think Cardinal O'Malley said to the Oblates, well, give Jim something. At least you can't just say no, 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 give him something. And he can refuse it, and he probably will, because, who's going to go through an exhumation? So anyway, they sent me a letter and they said I could do it. No press can be on the property. I have to pay for it myself. I have to restore the grounds myself. And it was like a poker game at that point because they were hoping I would say no. But I said yes. And months later, after getting permits and finding a forensic anthropologist that would have the ability to do a gravesite exhumation, and I found a good one, Dr. Anne Marie Myers, who actually exhumed found the remains of some of Whitey Bulger's victims up in Boston, and she agreed to do it. She was wonderful, and so in 19 2018, the day after his Father's Day, because we couldn't do it on Father's Day, we couldn't do it on a Sunday. We exhumed my father's remains up in the Tewksbury Oblite Cemetery on hallowed ground in that private little cemetery. 2 months later, we got the DNA back, and it was 99.9999 positive. And that's my story.
Thank you, Jim. It's moving. We had a couple questions from the audience members, like I mentioned, and I have a couple questions as well. So I'm going to start, since you were talking about some of the Catholic Church aspects. I think I'm going to start there. So can you mention, I know somewhere along the way they gave you your father's cross that they had after he passed away.
I have it right here.
Hold it up more so that people can see it. There you go.
It's pretty heavy. And this bounced off his chest for 35 years.
So I was really moved in your book that, specific people were, very sympathetic and helpful to you, even though the church stonewalled a lot. You had some real human stories about specific people.
And one in special is I mentioned I got mail from my mother. There was some conversations in the correspondence between my mother that was kind of a mystery at the time. I was getting care packages in Vietnam from a nun who I didn't know, so I just assumed that they're the Catholic Church or the Dominican nuns are supporting the guys overseas, and they just reached in and pulled out a name. And I'm getting these care packages, which were, well received from someone I didn't know. And after a couple of times, I mentioned it to my mother. And once I mentioned it to my mother and I gave her the address of the nun, the packages stopped. So in my following the paper trail, I got some documents about my father's medical records. And in there it said, in case of an emergency, call so-and-so. And there was the name of a nun there. And the name of the nun matched the writing in my letters from Vietnam. 35 years before.
Yeah, that was pretty incredible.
So it proves my father was following my life to some degree, and those care packages were indirectly coming from him at a time when I could use some help.
It's wonderful you were eventually able to connect with her. Um, I also want to ask you about your writing process. So in your book, you have some kind of flash forwards about exhuming his remains. So what was your writing process? Did you have someone who you worked with to write the book, or did you just kind of write it on your own, or what was your process?
Well, initially, I knew I was going to write a book almost the moment Melody said that your father was a priest. This is extraordinary stuff, and you normally read about this. It happened to somebody else, but here it happened to me. So as I went on, I had a journal and I kept notes, good notes, and I got to a point a couple of years ago that I wrote about 23 chapters. And I had somebody in Clemson University near where we live. He heard about my story, and we had lunch, and he said, if you need some help with that, I can give you a hand. And he writes novels that have been published on Amazon, but not a Catholic, but he loved the story, and so he took every chapter and we went through it and revised it. And someone said to me that it's a great story, a literary agent, but it's all about the writing, and it really needs to be improved. It's a great story; it should be told. So one more time, I looked for a writer to help me, and it was an editor actually from Canada. My wife is from Canada as well, and I asked him if he would help, and he said, sure. Peter Behrens is his name. And I acknowledge both of these gentlemen, Kelly Durham and Peter Behrens, in the forward of the book, near the forward of the book. And so he enhanced it. The big part was that I used to write annual reports and quarterly reports, financial material for these public companies that I represented at one point. But there you're writing about fact. You're not pulling out emotions, and that's what the literary agent kept saying. You gotta tell it the way it is. How you felt about it from your heart. And Peter Behrens was able to do that.
Thank you. Okay, so we have a couple questions in the chat, but I'm gonna ask the questions that we got in the registration before we move over there. So one is, when you first learned the truth, what part of your identity felt the most destabilized, and what was the first piece that you worked on to rebuild identity?
You mean because I'm not a Graham, so my new identity, is that what you're saying, Betsy?
Yeah, so destabilized who you thought you were all those years. What was so I guess, if you could talk about that and then talk about how you rebuilt your identity from there.
I mean, I've always been a positive thinker. If you lived in the Graham household, you think you get dragged down, but I always looked at the other side, that the glass was half full. And, once I knew that, people are going to object to tell me the truth, they're going to, really stonewall me. I just got stronger. The more they stonewalled me, the more I knew I was going to have to find out the truth, and I wasn't going to quit. This was a book I was going to finish. This was a story I was going to finish. This was something I was going to prove, since it was denied all my life. So I'm not sure what you mean by identity, but I've always been a positive thinker, even though I grew up in a home that was certainly, not the best situation.
Okay, thanks. And then the same person had another question. At any point, did you feel compassion for the individuals who hid your truth? And if so, how did you balance the empathy with your justified anger?
I live in the South right now, and Catholic Church is not strong down here like it was up in Massachusetts. So when I talk about the power of the Catholic Church, most people don't really identify with it down here. But the Catholic Church was powerful then, and even more so then than it is now. and they had the ability to coerce people. And I'm not sure what they offered the Grahams and everybody else that knew about it, because it wasn't just, a few people. There had a lot of people knew the secret, even people that my mother knew, because I had to go through her when she died. I went through her personal effects and called up people that I heard her talk about, never met them before, and they said, why should I tell you if your mother didn't tell you? So it impacted a lot of people, this conspiracy, this scheme that went on for, 50 years. Um, I'm sorry, I went on and I forgot what of the empathy for the people involved. So I'm saying that um, even John Graham, I have a little empathy for him, because as Kathryn said, this is the only way it could be. I had to look like I was his son. So the Grahams were told that they had to do this, and they all did it. I mean, three of them went to the graves with a secret. My mother, my real father, and John Graham. Otto Graham, was unhappy with me because I was, critical of his brother. So he leaked it, and they tried to put the genie right back in the bottle.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we have a couple participants that had questions as well, and one ties in to what you were talking about. So your mother was deceased already by the time the secret came out, correct?
Correct.
And
Although,
did she?
although on her deathbed, and Melody, my wife, was there. They had hospice in her apartment. She was there to see my mother pass. I was on a business trip, and I couldn't go back and forth, so I was out. I think I was in the Midwest at that particular point. But before I went out there, my mother knew her demise. She knew she just had weeks to live, and she and I were just talking, the two of us, privately, quietly, and trying to avoid the what's going to happen in 2 weeks. We talked about everything else but that. But then at the end, she said, "Do you remember somebody from the time you were in the orphanage, a man from the time you were in the orphanage?" And I said, "Well, how old would I have been?" And she said, "2." "Oh, you wouldn't have remembered." And that was the end of the conversation. So it seemed like, as she about to pass, she almost thought maybe she should tell me, but she didn't.
Mhm. Were there any other family members on her side? Her second husband was already deceased too, I think, right? By the time you
Correct.
found out, was there any other family members on her side to ask?
There's my Aunt Ethel, her sister. My mother was one of 4 siblings. Two of her sisters died early, like 18 and 21, one in a car crash, one of TB. But her sister Ethel survived all of them. And I went to Ethel, and I really had a great rapport with her. She's also in the book. I have a picture of her in the book. And I asked her, I said, "You got to tell me what happened to her." She said, "Well, your mother never told me." I said, "Come on, Ethel. You guys are good friends. Your sister, she had to tell you." "No, she never told me." So she stayed that way for about a year and a half. And I finally said to her that, I have information from Otto, and I'm going to see him. And he says, "You know everything." And so she admitted she did, and she broke down and cried. She said, she cried, and she said, I knew you were in that house, that Graham house, you didn't belong there, and I never did anything to get you out of there. So she felt guilty. But once she confided in, once she told me she knew everything, we knocked on a couple doors of my mother's friends that she knew. Unfortunately, the woman that drove my mother and me to the train station the day my mother escaped down to New York, that woman had died just a couple weeks before. When we went to her door, the neighbor said she had passed away. So it was too bad, because I could have talked to her if Ethel had told me early on that she knew, because that woman would have a lot of information about what my mother's feelings were at that point.
Well, I commend your determination, and it's just incredible how much you pursued this. I wonder, from the other stories that you've heard of other people who were fathered by priests, it seemed, I don't know a lot about it, so that's a new situation to me. So I don't know how common this is, but I thought it was somewhat extraordinary that the two of them fled, taking you, and he left the church until he was like caught and kind of forced almost to come back, and you were taken then to her ex-husband, to be raised as his child. So it feels to me like you got your determination from them. They really tried to make it work against all odds.
It was their story. It's not just my story. It's my parents' story, and the church is just going to sweep them under the rug.
Yeah.
Wasn't going to let
And
that.
I know. Go ahead.
I wasn't going to let that happen.
Yeah. I know in the book some of the pieces that you put together were around the financial dealings and the way that the church, must have given money for your education that ended up going different places, and the degree that the church went to investigate this and bring him back to the fold and hide you.
And it was incredible that everybody kept the secret for so long. And when you think about it, it was only retribution, not love.
Mm-hmm.
Let the secret out. Because I criticized John Graham for being unfatherly. And that's being kind to say he's unfatherly. It was worse than that.
Mm-hmm. Have you connected with other people who were fathered by priests? Is there a community of people, and has that been helpful for you?
And no, there is Vincent Doyle that Mike Resendez mentioned in the video. He's in Ireland, and he was a son of a priest. He's the psychiatrist, and he put out a website years ago, Coping International, and anybody can go there and go on it and take a look. But he's got a lot of followers now, children of priests, and he calls me the legend though, because I'm the only one that proved my father was my father by having his remains exhumed and getting a DNA test. So at the moment, there probably be others that may do it, but so far he calls me the legend.
Mm-hmm. So in our adoption world, we have a lot of support groups where people get together and talk about all of this. Have you had that opportunity with other children of priests to get together with people and share stories?
We've gotten together email-wise and on the phone. Now with social media, it's easy to do it that way. You not actually visit, but yes, and actually the division NSAP, which is the clergy's sexual abuse victims, they have a large organization, well financed, because there's lots of contributions, and they do a lot of work. Actually, they're in Rome right now, knocking on the Pope's door. But those people were hoping that my book would come out and it would be just another strike against the Catholic Church, because there's other abuses in the church, not just the sexual abuses.
Yeah, I mean, it's really incredible that they allowed you to exhume his body, and I understand you didn't think that they didn't necessarily take him up on it, but yeah,
they didn't think I would. So it was a poker game, and I won.
Yeah. So somebody did post the link to the Coping International in the chat. If anybody's interested, and we will send that out with other information from the program. We do have one person on this evening that's sharing that she's a secret on both sides of her biological families. And she's asking, and you might have already kind of answered this, but what was the motivation to keep pursuing your truth? She shares that her maternal side is devout Catholic.
Well, my motivation was that they were stonewalling me, so there had to be a lot of information they didn't want to be let out. And again, I looked at my parents' situation and what they did to them. I just said it's a story that has to be told, and while I'm telling it, I have to prove my case, which I did.
Mm-hmm. We have time for maybe one last question, if anybody has anything burning before we wrap up. Or I can start wrapping things up. I'm going to put the link here for our search program in case there's anybody there who's in search or thinking of searching. We might be able to be helpful to you. I'm also going to put the link of where you can find the recording of this session and of previous Mondays. And I'm going to put the link for the survey for tonight's program. So on our Monday evenings, we always have a quick survey at the end, so you can let us know your thoughts and let us know if you have any suggestions for future speakers. So please take a minute. It's pretty brief. You can take just a minute to give us your thoughts on that. We do have a couple Mondays coming up still here in November. Next week on the 10th, we're hearing from Kim Dykes talking about healing yoga with for grief and loss. She's actually going to do some yoga that we can do together even virtually. She's also going to be doing a live session with us here in Cleveland in January. And then Monday the 17th, so in 2 weeks, birth mother Beth Jaffe is going to be talking about when a private adoption story becomes a public reckoning. So you can join us for those. Thank you for being here this evening, and thank you so much, Jim, for volunteering your time with us.
Thank you,
it's
Betsy.
really a pleasure to have you.
Thank you, Betsy, and thank you all that watched and listened.
Thank you. Adoption Network is a membership-based organization, and you can take a look at our website if you're interested in joining us and supporting our work. We thrive because of you. So thank you for joining us this evening. We do have several support groups as well. So if you haven't plugged into any of our general meetings, you can find the calendar on our website. I know sessions like this can bring up a lot of feelings for people, so we're there to support you through it. So thanks for joining us. Good night.
Good night, Cleveland.